My name is Trisha Logan. I'll be your moderator for today, and today's subject is the Indigenous-led initiatives. 1 year ago, the University of British Columbia here hosted an expert seminar to support the work of the United Nations expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And in preparing a report with recommendations on the repatriation of ceremonial objects, human remains, and the intangible heritage of Indigenous peoples currently held in the hands of state institutions like museums and universities to the United Nations Human Rights Council. The report was presented and adopted in October of 2020. Some of the organizers and attendees will discuss several of the points and the recommendations. And this conversation here will discuss repatriation initiatives and how they've led their way on 3 different continents. 2 different continents. And these will include the development of repatriation guides and ethical guidelines, community advocacy, and a broader conversation. So good morning, everyone. And I'm Trisha Logan. I work at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center here at UBC, and I'm also cross-appointed with the School of Information. And I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to everyone today from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And I'm part of this campus and this body of knowledge that's also tied to this territory. And I've been so warmly welcomed to this territory. And I also want to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe and the Métis, where I come from the Robinson Superior Treaty area of Kakabeka Falls, Ontario, and where I grew up and that's the territory where I acquired a lot of my teachings and a lot of the knowledge that I work with and that I connect my own teachings to. So I want to acknowledge that as well. And I'm just going to share my screen for like 1 minute. I want to start this talk by sharing a piece of art by professor and artist and curator and historian and auntie Sherry Fell-Rissette. I love this piece of art and I share it all the time in my classes. It's just right directly off the website. It's called Ancestral Women Taking Back Their Dresses, and it's from 1990, and it's this beautiful painting from Sherry Fell-Rissette, and she painted it after visiting museums in Europe, throughout Europe, and like a lot of us do, travel to Europe and to other countries to see belongings and ancestors and ceremonial items that were made by our relatives. And so in the back, you can see the gray building that it represents the museums. And I'm sure I won't go too much into it, but this painting means a lot to me. I really love it. And Sherry often talks about how things were made, especially beadwork and embroidery and sewing, and how a lot of items or subject headings in museums attribute to perhaps sometimes to a nation or to a person, but not always to the person who made it, and that it was always or quite often women and grandmothers and aunties and sisters who made the beadwork and sewing and embroidery and the pieces. So I just wanted to share that briefly to start out our talk, because I really love that piece of art and the work that Sherry does. And that's as a Michif scholar, it's a lot of the work that I connect to.
Lasti too long, Stalkaus Hinadikian, Dio Hadagang, Dio Odagang, Hadagwais Dia Skagang, Itlkunisi Di Kuyarang Uslang. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stalkaus, and my English name is Lucy Bell, and I come from the Haida Nation. And I'm zooming you from Haida Gwa. I've been in isolation, getting a little sick of myself, so I'm glad to see so many of you here with us today. And I've been working in repatriation in Haida museology for about 30 years, and it's been quite the journey to see where museums are at, and to help museums move along in decolonizing their thinking, the way that they do business, and to Haida-I's museum practice out there. I'm a little bit starstruck to be here with Amy. I've been reading Amy's work as I work on my PhD. I'm a PhD candidate at SFU, focusing on Indigenous museology. So I'm just so excited to be sitting with you today.
I'm Amylontree, and I'm an enrolled citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and we're in Wisconsin. I was born in Ho-Chunk ancestral territory in Baraboo, Wisconsin, but I was raised in the dynamic urban native community of Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people. I'm now currently an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And my research focuses on the changing historical relationship between Native people and museums. I have been thinking about museums for several decades now. I also worked at museums, particularly the Minnesota Historical Society, at a moment when the museum in the 90s was putting new museum theory into practice. I also worked very briefly at the British Museum for 6 months on an exchange program that was also very informative in my thinking. And I also worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. And that research at those institutions reached final form in my book, Decolonizing Museums, Representing Native American National and Tribal Museums, that was published in 2012. And I'm now continuing work in the field of Native American history and looking particularly at a Ho-Chunk specific project. And I'm writing a visual history of the Ho-Chunk Nation from 1879 through the 1960s. But my work in museums has continued as I've pursued that other research project. And I'm currently involved with efforts to develop the University of California's repatriation policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that this morning. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you, Lucy, too, for your beautiful words. I really appreciate that. And I want you to know, I teach, of course, a course on museums. It's obviously my passion, so I make sure that's in my teaching repertoire. And one of the documentaries that I share with my students every year is The Stolen Spirits of Haida Gwaii. And the students love it. It moves them to tears. It is so richly layered and absolutely beautiful. So I just want to say that your nation's leadership has informed my pedagogy over the last several decades, and I want to thank you for all those efforts.
Lise-Marie Hjortfors. Good evening, my name is Lise-Marie Hjortfors, and I'm a Lule Sami, and I work as an ethnologist and researcher and senior advisor at Lule Sami Museum in Drag in Norway. But I live in Sweden, in Gällivare, 12 miles south from Kiruna in the northern Sweden. At our museum, we work with difficult and ethical issues, documentation and research and exhibitions. And I also work with oral histories and personal narratives. And just now I am working with my doctoral thesis, and I'm focusing on Laestadianism and identity in the Lule Sami area in Sweden and Norway. It's about religion. I'm a board member of International Council of Museums, International Committee of Ethical Dilemmas, and a board member of Ethical Council of Sametinget in Sweden. And at the Ethical Council at Sametinget, we worked with ethical guidelines and how to take care of cultural objects and human remains. And I'm so happy to be in this panel together with you all.
And so I'll start out. I have a few questions that I drafted here, and I wanted to kind of start to lead the conversation, but as a global conversation series, I really welcome everyone to kind of use it as a conversation and use it to speak about your own work a little bit more. I know I mentioned this several times, but going back again to the conversation that started here last March, and we were kind of thinking back to last March, it was the last event we had right before we all were sent home from work. I remember I came down to the Longhouse to see some of the sessions because I was working in my office at the time. And I remember feeling kind of anxious and rushed because I thought, you're not going to be in your office next week. And so to focus a little bit on the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples and on their statements about repatriation and the return of cultural heritage, or to think broadly about UNDRIP and the work in these areas, I think I want to ask that question about what kind of advances you've seen maybe in the last year, maybe overall, any changes as a result. Do you see museums addressing either the expert mechanism and the work they did on repatriation or the UNDRIP, any significant changes, small changes, or perhaps no changes at all, or a desire for change to happen that hasn't happened yet? And yeah, so I'll hand that over to our panelists.
Hey, that's a big question, and being in lockdown for so long, it's put us in such an interesting situation, in a new way of communicating. And what I've been noticing is more communication with museums. Our Haida Repatriation Committee is crazy busy talking to so many different museums, and it's not by email anymore. It feels like it's a little more personal to see somebody's face when we're talking about something so important to us. That makes a difference, and to be bringing our committee together more often and having new members join our Haida Repatriation Committee in the last few months, that's been really huge and I think powerful. There's a unity happening, I think, amongst Indigenous people, and the amount of Indigenous communities that are starting repatriation, they've been reaching out to us and asking to jump on and meet our committee and coming to us for advice. I love how I like to say we're warrioring up, and the Indigenous people are being more united in our repatriation efforts and looking for the tools for success in repatriation. That's been quite great. I like seeing how museums are thinking about UNDRIP, and I feel like that's kind of maybe it's a bit stuck right now, like maybe overthinking it a bit, and trying to get it into action, I think, and getting the money to back up some things. Museums are striving to be more online, having to respond and be a little more tech savvy with their collections to be able to share those collections a bit more. I see a little bit more of that happening, and it's probably a little slower than we like. Here in BC, we have more funds going towards repatriation. Some communities are still in the startup phase, so they're getting their ducks in a row, and that's another thing I've noticed in the last couple of years happening. I think I'm gonna leave that there and pass it on.
For Lucy for those remarks, and Tricia for the question. I'm really going to focus my remarks on work that I'm currently involved with here in California. Now, repatriation, as we know, is of great importance to Indigenous nations and is a decades-long struggle, and the work continues. And currently, the University of California is comprised of 10 campuses, and I work at one of those, the University of California, Santa Cruz, but I received my PhD from another one, the University of California, Berkeley. So we're currently involved with finalizing the Native American Cultural Affiliation and Repatriation Policy, which is a major revision to an earlier policy that was drafted following the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990. Now, NAGPRA, as we know, is important human rights legislation designed first and foremost to address the historical inequities of past collecting practices, the continual disregard for Native American religious beliefs and burial practices, and a clear contradiction between how the graves of white Americans and graves of Native Americans have been treated. Now, the University of California has one of the largest collections of ancestors and cultural items or cultural belongings subject to NAGPRA in the United States. And they are mostly at the Berkeley campus. And while some of the UC campuses have repatriated ancestors and cultural belongings to tribes, other campuses, including Berkeley, have been resistant to repatriation as required by state and federal law. Now, in response to the unique historical experiences of California tribes, as well as the number of non-recognized tribes in the state and the challenges of achieving repatriation, in 2001, the state of California passed its own repatriation legislation, the California Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as CAL-NAGPRA. And an amendment to this legislation, AB 2836, enacted in 2018, was later incorporated into CalNAGPRA. And as a result of this legislation, the University of California system needed to develop a new repatriation policy. And they appointed a work group of 4 representatives from California Indigenous nations and 4 members of the University of California Academic Senate to assist in drafting this new policy along with the staff from the UC Office of the President. And I am one of those, pardon me, excuse me, I'm one of the 4 University of California representatives. And I offer this just to provide context on the work and really wanting to underscore that the California NAGPRA, the law, came about as a result of California Indigenous activism. This did not happen because of academic epiphanies. This came about because California Indigenous communities were concerned about the University of California's steadfast resistance to repatriation in those years. Excuse me. So we've been at work on this new policy. Our work group is called the UC Native American Cultural Affiliation and Repatriation Policy Work Group, quite a mouthful. And we started work on the policy in April of 2019. And over a 15-month period, we held 24 meetings totaling around 100 hours. And the University of California's Office of the President also held 4 all-day listening sessions with tribes in early 2020. And we also reviewed countless pages of comments to the draft policy, and that work continues. On July 24th of 2020, then President Janet Napolitano issued the current UC policy as an interim policy. And the policy clearly states that, quote, repatriation or disposition of all Native American and Native Hawaiian human remains and cultural items is a fundamental objective and value of UC that must be accomplished as expeditiously and respectfully as possible. So that's stated up front in the policy. Now, it's important to note that they plan for the final policy to be issued at the end of 2020, but plans change, or they change course due to passage of AB 275. And on September 29th, 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law AB 275, which went into effect of January 1st of 2021. And so what AB 275 did was make significant changes to CalNAGPRA, and the University of California is now working on revising the interim policy to reconcile with the new requirements that include providing greater deference to tribal traditional knowledges when making determinations of cultural affiliation. So UC then decided, rather than issuing the final policy in December 2020, as I mentioned, they would allocate additional time for consultation and revisions to the policy. And UC is now planning to issue its new policy by July 31st, 2021. Now, the new University of California policy is long overdue. As I said, the University of California has one of the largest collections subject to NAGPRA in the United States, and they have a history of steadfast resistance to repatriation. In fact, I started working on this issue in 2007 and 2008, and it was really stunning when I really studied what was happening as I was listening to Indigenous leaders and activists talk about how challenging it was to work with the University of California, how they just were hostile to repatriation. So this is a change, a needed change. And it came about due to the leadership and activism on the part of California's Indigenous people and nations who recognized that the University of California is falling short with their efforts to repatriate ancestors. And they pushed, excuse me, for the passage of AB 2836 and AB 275 to ensure compliance throughout the University of California system. So these changes happening at the University of California are part of an ongoing movement of Indigenous people and nations pushing colonial institutions that have been steadfast in their resistance to repatriation and requiring them to follow both the spirit and the intent of NAGPRA by repatriating ancestors and cultural belongings to descendant communities. So the work of the policy revisions are still underway. And I'm also serving on a committee at the University of California, Berkeley specifically. And that work has been really eye-opening. So the work continues. And I'm going to leave my remarks there for now.
A lot happens in Sápmi, in the Sami area, this last years. In Sweden, we have repatriation of human remains, Sami people, to different areas in the Sami area. And in Norway, we have there have been a big project for a couple of years called Båstedet, getting back the things. And I can show you a book. This book had come this year. And it's called Båstedet, The Return of Sami Cultural Heritage. And it's about 4,300 objects collected from all over the Sami area in Norway to the Norwegian Folk Museum and Cultural Historical Museum in Oslo. And this Båstedet project worked with these two museums and have an agreement to get back the Sami collections. And it's the half collections going back to 6 Sami museums. So we have an agreement and we are going to get back our Lule Sami collections to my museum. So we are going to back 350 items to our museum, and they are to the other museums. They are going other collections from their area, and it's a very, very important project, this Båstedet project. And the book I showed you before is in English, so you can read about the project and the processing all over the years, how they have worked with repatriation and the things so important for the people to get back their things because they haven't seen them for a long time, and they want it back to the local area. And when we got our things to our museum, we are going to build up an exhibition and show them for the people, for the Sami people in the area and other people coming to the museum. But it's very important to have them back, and they can show the things and study them to study, to do things or to research on them. Both in Sweden and Norway, we have worked with ethical guidelines for museums And it's important to have ethical guidelines because it's important to have decide how to work with research in our area, and how the people are studying about the Sami culture, they have to give back something to the area when they are studying our culture. I'm sitting in the Sami Parliament Ethical Board, and then we have work with the guidelines, and it's about human remains and artifacts. So 2019, there have been a big repatriation to an area called Lycksele. So they are having back 25 human remains to the area, back to buried in the area Lycksele. So it's very important to do that, and the processes is so important for the people.
And it is such important work, and I know that the repatriation portion and the return of heritage isn't for all of you. It's not your whole job, but it has become your life's work, because it has carried on for a long time, and it is something that there's this level of continuity and continuance, and being able, there's such a feeling of reconnecting, that feeling to reconnect people with their ancestors and their belongings and their knowledge and their language. And I think the next thing I'm wondering about, or the next thing I was going to ask about, is because this work, it is a life's work. It is a work with communities and with your own communities, and with partnerships with museums and universities, that is over a long period of time, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of strength to carry on. From my perspective too, I think I'm just kind of learning about museums and how this works or how this doesn't work. There's a lot of education and there's a lot of dialogue that has to carry on with museum management or university management and boards and executives and staff and scholars. And so there's constant points of tension and real difficulty in the development of repatriation guides, in creating new policies, in renewing existing policies, and educating museums broadly. It's you're having the same conversations over and over sometimes. And you can see there's still resistance from museums and universities and institutions and archives to change their practices. And I was wondering if you can talk about some of those constant points of tension, things that seem like they keep coming up, or things that no matter how much, points to that need continual education and more information to give back to keep presenting back to museums and boards and executive and management and universities.
Another big question. Thank you. The Haida have been working with global museums for a couple of decades, maybe more than a couple, and I think that the further away we were getting from home, the more work we had to do, the more dialogue that had to happen. And this was back in the day when we had to write letters, and bring them to the post office. So that was really difficult, and to change attitudes and to assert our rights and our beliefs. Each time we talked to a museum, I felt like we were getting stronger in our own authority over our belongings. And in Haida, we would call it, we're tying the lease. The lease is like the string. It's like the umbilical cord that connects us to our mothers, to our generations before. And I believe that same string connects us to our belongings. And we went to each museum with that understanding that those are ours, those belong to our ancestors. And you can't talk to me like that. You can't talk about my ancestors, my ancestors' treasures like that. So really, it was about us becoming stronger in asserting our rights and our responsibilities, and museum folks deciding if they were ready for that. And I think it's a learning journey, and it really helps. It really helped. A strategy that we used was to treat our museum colleagues like friends, that we're in this journey together, that your world might be turned upside down by the Haida, but you're going to like it. And I think that did happen. You know, we took so many people back to Haida Gwaii. They came and lived with us. They became friends with us, and you know, we brought them to potlatches. We made them carry our ancestors to the burial site. That changes people, and we made a conscious decision that we were going to change the museum world slowly but surely, and I think it's helped. One piece of a policy piece I will mention that helped with this change is going with a letter from our Council of Haida Nation and our hereditary leaders. They all signed a letter many years ago, giving our Haida Repatriation Committee the authority to speak for our ancestors in museums, to speak for our belongings. And that, in addition to the task force report on museums and First Peoples here in Canada, we armed ourselves with those two documents and said, we're here in friendship. Let's get this done.
The documentary Stolen Spirits of Haida Gwaii shows that, right, of the building relationships in that instance with the field museum staff. It's really powerful and very moving. Yes, in terms of this work, thank you, Tricia, for raising how challenging this work can be, and how in some ways it feels like it's on a continual loop, right? I first got involved in 2007-8 when I learned about the Berkeley's non-compliance. And that was very stunning to me, because you had researchers who were arguing that they are these great collaborators with Native people on that campus, but yet what was happening on their campus at the same time was this steadfast resistance and hostility to tribes and a refusal to repatriate. And I always kind of wondered, you know, these people who are talking about their great collaborative relationships with tribes, you know, geez, the contradiction there. I mean, if you can't stand up for tribal primacy and determining what happens to their ancestors, this is the central issue, then all of your other forms of collaboration look pretty hollow. And so I was really concerned at that point in time that there seemed to be, you know, a lack of awareness and a serious lack of, you know, of just, they were unwilling to change course, right? And it was only through the activism and the leadership of California Indigenous peoples and their allies that we've reached this point in the University of California system. I do want to add that a couple of the campuses have repatriated, right? But Berkeley, where a majority of the cultural belongings and ancestors are located, have been hostile. Okay, so dealing with that over the years has been very challenging and difficult. And while I see the policy, obviously there's work to still be done. You know, we need to, of course, continue to listen to California Indigenous people and make sure that the policy is effective as it needs to be, that it's in compliance with both state and federal law, and also to think about NAGPRA as the floor, and we're going to the ceiling. We recognize that this is human rights legislation, right? I don't have to have that debate anymore. Remember how we always had to say this is about a balance between the interest of science and Native Americans. What has been interesting to witness is that I have seen leadership on the campus acknowledge that this is human rights legislation. But I still have concerns moving forward, as I said, obviously regarding California Indigenous peoples and their views on the policy and whether or not they see this as it will be effective. And in assisting with repatriation. And also, I'm really concerned about resources. I mean, Berkeley has anywhere between, 9,400 ancestors to 11,000. So that's a significant number. And I have yet to hear concrete allocation of resources or concrete numbers from the administration to facilitate the return of those ancestors. This is going to take a very, very long time. And it can't be done on a shoestring budget. They have to devote the resources there. Otherwise, it will be an unfunded mandate. And the second point I just want to make quickly is on the issue of accountability. I've been really thinking about this issue. I know that the policy and the shift in, let's say, the composition of committees that are making determinations about repatriation have changed at the University of California, Berkeley, and will change system-wide. But I do think that there needs to be a historical reckoning. I think these colonial institutions need to do a deep dive into their history on their relationship with Indigenous nations. And we can look, for example, to the University of Minnesota, one of my alma maters, they are currently conducting an exhaustive historical study over the broad sweep of their history, of their relationship with Indigenous nations. We need to, obviously, this is most important, as we know, with apology and moving forward to putting things right, that you have these new policies and mandates in place, but you also have to do that historical recounting. You have to face the hard truths of what you have done. Be specific and be accountable. And I think without that historical recounting, I think that it kind of is, it's just not as effective as it needs to be. That deep historical reckoning has to take place, and institutions need to be accountable for that history.
Yeah, I think it's an important work to work with the Sami collections and repatriation. And we work very close to the Sami community and find practices for work with repatriation, and we take the responsibility to work ethical. But we want the government to say sorry for the things they have done to us, the Sami people. We want to get the rights for language and culture heritage and get back our things. But it's a small steps to get. It's take a very long time to find solutions for this, and it's also economical and funding. We have to discuss to get our things back from Oslo in Norway to our museum. You have to have funding and economical money to get it back to our museum. So it's different things we have to discuss. But the most important work is to work close to the Sami community, I think, because they are the people who they trust us as a museum, and we are Sami people working there. So we know how to behave in the area when we do the research or we talk about repatriation. So yeah, I think it's very, very important to think ethical and take responsibility for the ancestors.
Thank you so much. And as I said, as someone who had worked in a previous life at a national museum that was dedicated to human rights of Indigenous people, it was always an interesting irony that in talking about rights and human rights, and in the case where repatriation came into that conversation, you're representing human rights in a national museum in Canada, where Canada is the funder and Canada is the violator of those rights. So a lot of these conversations always had this air of irony, and it means a lot to me to continue to learn and to continue that continuity those conversations. There's a really great question I just saw come up in the Q&A, and I'd like to ask, because I'm mindful of the time, like we will try to stick to an hour for the panel, but there's a question here in the Q&A that I think is really great, and it's something I think about and consider in my work all the time. Much of repatriation relates to cultural items and to artifacts that are housed in museums. How do we deal with other culturally important resources such as recordings, audio and video that may have been obtained inappropriately or without permission? And 2, living items such as plants or seeds?
Good question. Haida language is one of my other passions, and it's been quite the journey to gather up our language resources from museums. I've been a part of a 3-week Breath of Life workshop with the Smithsonian, and that was really quite a journey for us to be immersed with our resources, and for that program to be set up with funds to get 3 of us from my language group there to be so immersed in our language resources, and for them to have the funds for us to take home what we wanted out of that collection. That is, I think, a success story about language revitalization. Museums like the Museum of Anthropology and the Royal BC Museum, they have digitization programs to be digitizing language resources and getting them back to communities. The RBCM archives, they'll provide those free of cost to Indigenous people that need these resources, and it's in response to the calls to the TRC, providing access to these resources. And these sound like simple steps, but I know from being on the inside just how much work that is for museum people to do that. So I really do admire the museums that are taking those steps to digitize and get the intangible heritage back to communities. And that includes language resources and photos and maps. I find museums aren't quite ready to release originals, but maybe communities don't necessarily want original big old reel-to-reels. But I've been noticing that communities are wanting, the most up-to-date version that they can get access to, and that seems to be happening at a much faster rate than the return of belongings and the return of ancestors. It seems to be easier to put, thousands of photos on a memory stick and mail it to somebody or send it via email. So I do. Raise my hands to the museums doing that.
Very, very good question. And we've had, these conversations. I am a historian, right? So I've been working with ethnographic field notes and thinking through that, and also with photographs. And you see some of the institutions that have kind of, have really moved forward and taken care of their responsibilities in terms of cultural belongings and ancestral remains. And then they kind of move that. I've seen kind of progression. And I'm thinking of a place like, for example, the University of Michigan. And Sonia Atalay writes about their efforts that, they were once an institution that was steadfast, resistant to repatriation. They repatriated ancestral remains and cultural items. And then from there, they started having conversations about other collections. And because they had built relationships, this is all of these moments of repatriation. And if you're working collaboratively with tribes, these are important relationship building moments. And they also had other collections such as seeds. And so they worked collaboratively to determine what should happen with those seeds. And so I think this is part of ongoing conversations also in the field of library, archives, and museums. I know many of you are probably familiar with Jane Anderson and Kim Christian's work on the TK labels and things like that these institutions are working with Indigenous nations to establish protocols around their use. So I think those conversations are continuing. Those are some of the scholars that I know that have written about it, and also the Association of Tribal Library Archives and Museums in the United States. They have panels that are focusing on that in their conferences. So those are some of the places. But yes, I feel like in some ways it's always kind of the next step, like institutions take care of repatriating those other items, but then they think, hey, wait a minute. And we do need to take care of our ethnographic collections. We do. I mean, there is very sensitive information in those documents. And I, as an Indigenous researcher, as a Ho-Chunk person, have been really, it's been very emotional for me to see some of that material. And yes, the Ho-Chunk Nation should be in a position to establish protocols around the use of those images, and also the use of ethnographic materials too, manuscripts.
It's very important to get back collections to the area and get access to our belongings and cultural heritage, and to digitalization with photos and interviews and videos in archives to handle our resources. So it's very important, I think. And now it's starting a big project to get archives free, digitalized in Sami area in Norway. So it's starting there, and we have it back to our community.
If you think everyone had anything else to add, I'll let you do that, but I know I'm mindful of the time and that we're coming to the end. I do see one question here that hopefully we can go around quickly and address, and it's a great question from my dear colleague Erin Millions from Winnipeg. What can we as university academics and staff do to move along this deep historical reckoning that Dr. Lontree is speaking to?
I think everyone that works in repatriation, in museums, in universities with Indigenous collections, educate yourself on no UNDRIP, no TRC. Read the task force report on museums and First Peoples and NAGPRA. Do some homework, and also do the work to be anti-racist, and do the work to check your biases, and be open and excited about the changes and the new relationships that will come out of repatriation. And one thing I encouraged when I was at the Royal BC Museum was to be ready, to make sure there's money set aside for repatriation, to make sure the ancestors were ready. If somebody came knocking on the door saying, I want my grandmother's bones back, are we ready to give them their grandmother's bones back in a day or two? And that was a lot of work for us to do, the prep work, to make sure that the ancestors were cared for, that we had ceremony for them, that we matched up paperwork with the ancestors. But it really made us become more aware, and to make sure that all of the staff were aware that there's ancestors in that collection, and to tread more carefully in the place that they worked. So really it is kind of a daily change to the mindset, I think, and to be very conscious of doing your best to show yakdung, to show respect to the ancestors and to the belongings is so important. Amy, what would you say?
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Great response. Do that deep work, research yourself in terms of these policies, and also the history of your institution's collections. And if I could just speak, I know that some people think, okay, how can this happen? One of the things that I think is so important, and certainly I draw on this with as a strategy with repatriation work, is take advantage of the community of practitioners. And that's why I offered and cited the University of Minnesota. They were featured in the Star Tribune newspaper about this work that they're undertaking to examine their historical relationship with Indigenous people. So advocate for that. And it needs to start at the top, right? It's wonderful when we have our people in certain departments who are really energetic staff member and scholar who wants to do this work, but this needs to happen at the top level and have university support, university-wide support. So I would say advocate for that and have this funded by, your chancellor's office or office of the president.
I think it's very important to work together, university, museums, communities, people, and the most important thing is to meet people, the indigenous people, and listen to them and hear what they want, and meet them where they are, and listen to them and work together in different processes. So that's the thing I will give to the people.
Merci to everyone. I just really want to thank everyone again. I think we're coming to the end of our time and time in this panel. The way I say that is weird. But for sharing your time with us today and for your incredible knowledge. You're all such amazing role models to all of us doing this kind of work or doing these work with communities. I really appreciate all of the work you do every day and for sharing it with us today. And I would just want to thank everyone who's on or join everyone who's online today to thank you very much for speaking with us today and having this conversation with us today. Merci, miigwech.